The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. A sleepy summary. The first thing Robert Greene wants you to understand is that you are not as rational as you think you are. This is the opening truth, the foundational uncomfortable fact upon which the entire enormous architecture of this book is built. You believe, because you are a modern person with an education and a capacity for self-reflection, that when you make decisions, you are mostly guided by logic and reason, and that your emotions, while present, are generally kept in their proper place. Greene would like to gently but firmly disabuse you of this notion. He would like to introduce you to the idea of the emotional self and the rational self, and he would like to suggest, with considerable historical evidence, that the emotional self is far more in charge than you realize, and that the rational self is frequently just a very eloquent spokesperson for decisions that were already made in the emotional basement long before logic arrived on the scene. This is not a pessimistic idea, or rather, it is not meant to be. Greene's entire project in this book is not to make you despair about human nature, but to make you a student of it, a careful, patient, compassionate but unsentimental student who watches human behavior the way a naturalist watches animals in the wild, with genuine curiosity and without too much judgment. The goal is understanding. The goal is to see clearly. Because once you see clearly, you can act wisely. You can stop being surprised by people. You can stop being blindsided by your own reactions. You can, slowly and with practice, become what Greene calls a higher type, someone who has looked into the full complexity of their own nature and decided, with intention and effort, what kind of person they want to be. Now, there are 18 laws in this book. 18. That is a great many laws, and they cover an enormous amount of territory, from envy to grandiosity, from conformity to narcissism, from aggression to death anxiety. And each law is its own small universe with its own stories, its own historical figures, its own psychological framework, and its own practical strategies for navigating this particular dimension of human experience. We are going to travel through all of them tonight, slowly and without hurry, the way you might travel through a very beautiful and slightly unsettling country you have always wanted to visit. Let us start, as Greene starts, with the law of irrationality. The law of irrationality tells us that we are creatures of emotion first and reason second, and that the higher part of our brain, the neocortex, the seat of reason, the part that reads books and makes plans and writes grocery lists, is perpetually in negotiation with older, deeper, more powerful parts of the brain that run on feeling and instinct and the accumulated emotional residue of everything that has ever happened to us. Greene traces this through the life of Pericles, the great Athenian statesman, who was remarkable among the leaders of his time precisely because he had trained himself to pause before reacting, to step back from the heat of the moment, to refuse to make decisions when he was angry or afraid or excited. This was not natural to him. It was a discipline, and it is meant to be a discipline for us too. The signs of irrationality, Greene tells us, are everywhere once you know how to look for them. There is the person who makes the same self-defeating relationship choice over and over again and calls it bad luck. There is the leader who surrounds himself only with people who agree with him and then is genuinely shocked when reality turns out to be different from his expectations. There is the person who responds to any criticism, no matter how gentle and well-intentioned, with a disproportionate flood of defensiveness and hurt. There is the person who has a dream but never acts on it, and who explains this with a series of very reasonable-sounding excuses that, if you look closely, are all made of fear. All of these are emotional static masquerading as rational thought, and the first step toward wisdom is learning to recognize the static for what it is. The strategy Greene recommends is something he calls the rational self. You observe yourself. You notice your emotional reactions. You do not suppress them or pretend they are not there, because they are there and they will not be ignored, but you create a little space between the feeling and the action. You ask, is this reaction proportionate to what actually happened, or am I being pulled by something older and deeper? You look for what he calls biases and filters, the unconscious lenses through which you see the world, shaped by childhood and temperament and experience, and you try to understand how they are coloring your perception of the present moment. This is not easy work. It is the work of a lifetime, but it is the foundation of everything else in this book. Lying beside the law of irrationality, breathing quietly, is the law of narcissism. And this law is particularly important because narcissism, in Greene's treatment of it, is not something that only affects a handful of especially difficult or self-absorbed people. It is a spectrum, and we are all on it. Every human being is born narcissistic. Newborns are pure need, pure self, pure demand, and the degree to which we move away from that original narcissism toward what Greene calls empathy is the degree to which we develop into functional, connected, effective human beings. Deep narcissists, and there are more of them than you think, and you have certainly encountered several, possibly loved one or two, are people who never really completed this developmental journey. They remain locked in a childhood universe in which they are the center, in which other people exist primarily as mirrors to reflect back their own magnificence, and in which any failure of the mirror to provide a perfect reflection is experienced not as normal human disagreement, but as a kind of catastrophic assault. The world of the deep narcissist is brittle and demanding. It exhausts everyone around them. And yet the deep narcissist is often enormously charming, at least initially, because they know how to make you feel temporally and strategically that you are wonderful, that you are the most interesting person they have ever met, that they see your specialness in a way no one else ever has. This is because they need your admiration the way other people need air. They are very good at extracting it. Greene spends considerable time on what he calls the seductive narcissist, the type who sweeps you into their world with tremendous energy and attention, only to gradually reveal that their interest in you was always, at bottom, an interest in their own reflection. He also describes the controlling narcissist, who maintains their sense of inner security by dominating every environment and every relationship, and who cannot tolerate unpredictability because unpredictability feels like a loss of control, and loss of control feels, to the narcissistic psyche, like annihilation. And he describes the high-functioning narcissist, the successful, apparently competent person whose narcissism has been channeled into ambition, who may achieve remarkable things, but who leaves behind a trail of burned relationships and bewildered former admirers. The antidote to narcissism in ourselves and in our dealings with others is empathy. Real empathy, not the performed sympathy that sometimes masquerades as it. Real empathy is the capacity to genuinely inhabit another person's perspective, to set down your own needs and agenda for long enough to truly feel what it is like to be someone else. This is harder than it sounds. It requires the temporary silencing of the inner voice that is always narrating everything in terms of how it relates to you. It requires curiosity about other people as full, complex, independent beings rather than as supporting characters in your own story. Greene suggests a kind of empathy practice, paying full attention to the people around you, studying their nonverbal cues, their emotional registers, their history, their fears, their desires, as a daily discipline, a way of training the narcissistic mind toward genuine connection. And then we drift, soft and slow, toward the law of role-playing. This is one of the more quietly astonishing of Greene's laws because it reveals something we half know and half forget constantly, that almost no one, in almost any social situation, is presenting their unmediated inner self. We are all the time, performing, not necessarily dishonestly, not necessarily cynically, but performing nonetheless, selecting which aspects of ourselves to present, which to conceal, adjusting our tone and posture and word choice to fit the expectations of the audience, the demands of the situation, the image we wish to project. This is not a flaw in human character, it is a feature. It is what allows us to function in complex social environments, to meet strangers and put them at ease, to present ourselves professionally in circumstances that require professionalism, to signal belonging and trustworthiness and competence through the 1,000 tiny cues that social life depends upon. The trouble comes when we either forget that we are performing, when we start to believe our own performance is the whole truth of who we are, or when we fail to read the performances of others clearly. Most people, Greene observes, are quite bad at detecting the gap between someone's performed self and their actual inner state, and this gap is where so much misunderstanding, betrayal, and disappointment originates. The colleague who seems enthusiastic and supportive is, beneath the performance, resentful and competitive. The partner who seems calm and unconcerned is, beneath the performance, churning with hurt and anxiety. The leader who seems confident and visionary is, beneath the performance, terrified and out of their depth. Greene teaches us to read the performance by watching not the words but the body, not the face, but the micro-expressions that flicker across it before the social mask snaps back into place. Not what people say about themselves, but the subtle incongruences between their stated values and their actual behavior. And he teaches us to be more sophisticated performers ourselves, not in a manipulative sense, but in the sense of understanding that how you present yourself shapes what is possible for you, and that a more conscious, intentional performance is almost always more effective and more honest than an unconscious one. Drifting now, drifting slowly, we come to the law of compulsive behavior. This one is like finding a quiet mirror in an old house. Greene's argument here is one of the most useful things in the entire book, that people's behavior is not random, and that most people, under sufficient stress or in circumstances that press on their particular psychological vulnerabilities, will revert to a small number of characteristic patterns that have their roots in early experience. The person who repeatedly chooses unavailable partners. The leader who repeatedly undermines the projects he most wants to succeed. The brilliant person who keeps finding ways to self-sabotage at the moment of greatest potential. These are not accidents. These are compulsions, deeply grooved behavioral patterns that operate largely below the level of conscious awareness, that feel in the moment like free choices, but are in fact the replaying of old emotional scripts. The way to see this in others is to pay attention to their history, especially their history under pressure. As Greene says, the most revealing thing about anyone is not how they behave when things are going well, but how they behave when things go wrong, when they feel threatened, when they are frustrated or humiliated or afraid. Under those conditions, the social performance drops away and the compulsive character emerges. And if you look at the pattern over time, if you look at how someone has responded to difficulty across multiple situations and relationships, you will begin to see the shape of their particular emotional repetition. The way to see this in yourself is harder but more important. It requires you to look honestly at the recurring painful patterns in your life, the kinds of situations you keep finding yourself in, the kinds of conflict you keep having, the kinds of projects that keep stalling in the same way, and to ask seriously whether these patterns might be telling you something about your own compulsive behavior. This is uncomfortable work. The emotional self will resist it, but it is the kind of work that can genuinely change the trajectory of a life. Settling into the softer chapters, we arrive at the law of covetousness. Human beings want things. More specifically, human beings want things that other people have, and the wanting is often entirely disconnected from any genuine assessment of whether those things would actually make them happy. Covetousness, wanting what belongs to others, envying what we see in others, scheming to obtain what we do not have, is as old as the species. It is wired into us by the evolutionary logic of social comparison. We are social animals, which means we are perpetually scanning our environment for information about where we stand relative to others, and when we perceive ourselves as lacking, as having less status, less beauty, less wealth, less love, less freedom than those around us, the emotional response is a complex mixture of desire and resentment that we call envy. Greene distinguishes carefully between envy and admiration. Admiration is the response you have to someone whose qualities you respect and wish to cultivate in yourself. It lifts you, it inspires you, it points toward a positive future. Envy is the response you have when someone's success or possession feels like a diminishment of your own worth, when their having something makes you feel that you have less, when their happiness provokes in you not joy but a cold, corrosive bitterness. Envy poisons the envier far more reliably than it harms its object. It is a miserable emotional state, and one of the great puzzles of human psychology is how thoroughly it is concealed. From others, certainly, but often from the person experiencing it as well. We rarely say, even to ourselves, "I am envious." We say instead that the other person is overrated or lucky or dishonest, or that they don't deserve what they have. We tell a story about injustice when what we are actually experiencing is the burning of wanting what we cannot have. The practical wisdom here is twofold. First, learn to recognize envy in others, because people who envy you will not tell you so, and they will often express their envy through subtle sabotage, through undermining praise, through a particular kind of cold and barely visible hostility that can be confusing and destabilizing if you do not understand its source. Second, learn to recognize envy in yourself, because it is information, because it tells you what you actually value, what you actually want for your own life, and because that information, turned from poison to fuel, can become the basis for positive action. And then the law of grandiosity, which is perhaps the chapter where the reader is most likely to say, slightly uncomfortable, "Oh, that's me." Grandiosity is not the same as confidence, and it is not the same as ambition. Grandiosity is the quiet or not so quiet belief that you are special in a way that the ordinary rules do not quite apply to, that your talents and qualities are so exceptional that the normal requirements of hard work and patience and incremental progress are somehow beneath you, that success should come more easily and more quickly to you than it does to ordinary people because you are not ordinary. This feeling is almost universal in some form or another, particularly in youth, and particularly in people who have genuine talent, because genuine talent early in life is often rewarded with praise and attention that can create a slightly inflated and not yet reality-tested sense of one's own capacities. The grandiose person fails not from lack of ability, but from lack of proportion. They take on projects that are beyond their current skills without the willingness to do the slow, unglamorous work of building those skills. They present themselves at a level that their actual accomplishments do not yet support, which creates a kind of credibility debt that eventually comes due. They bristle at criticism and coaching because criticism and coaching imply that they are not already who they believe themselves to be. They waste enormous energy on fantasies of future greatness rather than on the present, incremental, somewhat boring work that is the actual path to any significant achievement. Greene's historical example here and throughout the book is always instructive. He returns again and again to people whose lives illuminate the laws he is describing, people who embodied these patterns either in their most destructive form or in their most transformed form, who either surrendered to the worst of human nature or who managed, through effort and self-knowledge, to direct it towards something more constructive. The law of grandiosity is illustrated partly through figures whose inflated sense of themselves led to catastrophic overreach, and partly through figures, and this is the more interesting half, who learned to harness their sense of specialness without being enslaved by it, who turned what could have been grandiosity into genuine ambition grounded in genuine work. Now we are more than halfway through the laws, and the night is getting quieter, and we drift into the territory that Greene calls the law of short-sightedness. Human beings are, by evolutionary design, much better at responding to immediate threats and immediate rewards than to distant, abstract, or slowly developing situations. Our emotional and cognitive systems were calibrated for the immediate, for the predator in the grass right now, for the food available today, for the threat standing in front of us. Long-term thinking is a relatively recent cognitive achievement, and it is one that requires active effort to sustain against the powerful pull of the immediate. This manifests in 1,000 ways in modern life. The organization that sacrifices its long-term health for short-term performance metrics. The individual who trades a meaningful career for a comfortable but deadening job because the discomfort of the transition feels too immediate and the payoff of the better path feels too remote. The leader who chooses the expedient and popular decision over the difficult and correct one because the political cost of the difficult decision is immediate and visible, while its benefits are distant and uncertain. The person who responds to a complex, slowly developing crisis with the same emotional intensity as an immediate emergency, which causes them to either overreact or, conversely, to treat it as not real because it is not immediate. All of these are forms of short-sightedness, and they are so common as to be nearly invisible. The cure is what Greene calls the long view, the deliberate, disciplined practice of extending your time horizon when making decisions, of asking not only what this choice means right now, but what it will mean in a year, in 5 years, in 20 years. Of considering not only the immediate consequences of your actions, but the second and third order consequences, the ripple effects, the ways in which today's expedient solution creates tomorrow's intractable problem. This is not natural. It requires effort, but it is one of the qualities that most reliably distinguishes people who are genuinely effective over long periods of time from people who are merely reactive. The law of defensiveness is next, and it is one of the most practically useful chapters in the book, because it addresses something that anyone who has ever tried to change someone's mind, give feedback, or manage a difficult relationship will immediately recognize. Human beings do not, in general, respond well to direct challenges to their beliefs, their sense of identity, or their self-image. When you tell someone directly that they are wrong, or that their behavior is problematic, or that the project they have invested themselves in is failing, their first response is almost always not curiosity and openness, but defensiveness, a pulling back, a hardening, a marshalling of arguments and rationalizations to protect the sense of self that your challenge has threatened. This is not a character flaw in any particular person. It is a deeply human response, rooted in the fact that our beliefs and self-image are not merely intellectual positions that we hold at arm's length and can revise easily. They are part of who we are. Challenging them feels, at an emotional level, like a threat to existence itself. Which is why the direct approach, "You are wrong about this," "Your behavior is causing these problems," this approach is not working, so rarely produces the open, thoughtful reconsideration we imagine it will, and so often produces defensiveness, resentment, and entrenchment instead. Greene's strategy for dealing with human defensiveness is elegant and counterintuitive. Rather than attacking the position, You make the person feel heard and understood and respected first. You validate their perspective. You acknowledge what is correct or understandable about how they see the situation. And only then, from that foundation of established goodwill and trust, do you introduce a different perspective. And even then, you do not present it as a correction, but as an addition, a consideration, a possibility they might want to weigh. You make the other person feel that the new idea is one they arrived at themselves, or at least one they have genuinely chosen, rather than one that was imposed on them. This requires patience and self-restraint. It requires you to care more about actually influencing the situation than about being right. But it is far more effective than the direct approach, and it is far less likely to create permanent damage to the relationship. Softly now, we come to the law of self-sabotage. This is the chapter that asks the most personal and the most uncomfortable question. Why do we sometimes seem to work against our own interests, especially when we are closest to achieving something important? Why does the writer stop writing when the book is almost done? Why does the entrepreneur make a reckless decision just as the business is beginning to succeed? Why does the person in the healthy new relationship find ways to provoke conflict or create distance, just as real intimacy begins to develop? Greene's answer draws on the concept of what he calls the life force, a fundamental orientation toward growth, expansion, curiosity, connection, and engagement with the world, and its dark mirror, the death force, an orientation towards safety, stagnation, withdrawal, and the maintenance of the known and familiar, even when the known and familiar is not serving us. Self-sabotage in this framework is the death force expressing itself through ostensibly free choices. It is the part of us that is afraid of success, because success would require us to be a different, larger, more exposed version of ourselves. It is the part of us that is afraid of intimacy, because intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability has, at some point in our history, led to pain. It is the part of us that is afraid of the unknown, even when the unknown is genuinely better than the known, and that therefore engineers our own failure in order to return to the familiar. The recognition of this pattern in yourself is the beginning of its dissolution. When you notice that you are about to make a choice that, rationally considered, seems to be working against your own stated goals, and you can feel the pull toward that choice, the way it feels like relief, like stepping back from the edge, that is the moment to pause and ask what you are actually protecting yourself from. What is the fear that is driving this? What would it actually mean to succeed here? What would change about your life, your identity, your relationships? And then, is that change actually as threatening as it feels in this moment, or is the fear bigger than the actual risk? The law of repression is woven through this and reaches even deeper. It tells us that the aspects of ourselves we most energetically deny, disown, and push into the unconscious, the capacities for anger, for selfishness, for cruelty, for weakness, for strangeness, do not disappear when we deny them. They go underground. And underground, unacknowledged and unintegrated, they accumulate force and express themselves in indirect, distorted, and often destructive ways. The person who insists most vehemently that they never feel anger is often the person in whose presence everyone else feels most on edge, because the anger is there. It is just being expressed through sarcasm, through passive hostility, through a kind of cold and subtle punishment, rather than through the direct acknowledgement and appropriate expression that would actually release it. Jung called this the shadow, and Greene adopts the concept with enthusiasm. The shadow is not evil. It is simply the part of you that you have been taught, by family or culture or painful experience, is unacceptable. And the work of shadow integration, of slowly, carefully acknowledging these disowned parts of yourself and bringing them into conscious relationship with the rest of who you are, is not the work of becoming worse. It is the work of becoming more whole, more honest, more genuinely effective, and perhaps surprisingly, more genuinely kind. Because the people who do the most unconscious harm in the world are not the people who are aware of their capacity for harm. They are the people who are convinced they have none. The law of envy returns in a different key now, and we find ourselves in the chapter on envy as a social force. The way envy shapes group dynamics, organizational behavior, and the particular kinds of hostility that successful people attract. One of the central practical lessons here is that when you achieve success, you will almost inevitably attract envy from some of the people around you, and that this envy will often be expressed not directly, but through the specific, recognizable behavior of the person who wants to see you fail. Greene describes the envious colleague who always has a slightly too detailed critique of your work, the friend who celebrates your failures with slightly too much warmth, the acquaintance who subtly undermines your reputation in conversations you are not present for. These are not random unkindnesses. They are the signature behavior of envy, and recognizing them for what they are is both practically useful and emotionally liberating, because it allows you to stop taking the hostility personally, which is hard, and to instead see it as information about the other person's inner state, which is much more manageable. Now, breathing slowly, we come to the chapters on human aggression, on gender, on generational patterns, and on the death that waits at the end of every life. These are the chapters where Greene widens his lens from the individual to the social and the civilizational, and where the book becomes, in certain passages, almost philosophical. The law of aggression observes that human beings carry within them a capacity for aggression that is, like all the other dark aspects of human nature Greene catalogues, not an aberration but a feature. Aggression was adaptive. It protected resources, enforced social hierarchies, repelled threats. It still does all of these things. But in the modern world, naked aggression is mostly not acceptable, and so it has learned to dress in more respectable clothing. There is passive aggression, which is hostility expressed through withdrawal, non-cooperation, and the infinite creative possibilities of doing nothing when action was clearly expected. There is moral aggression, which is the use of righteousness and ethical framing as a vehicle for attacking and diminishing others while maintaining the social position of the person who is merely concerned or merely pointing something out. There is political aggression, which is the use of institutional power to punish and eliminate rivals while maintaining a public appearance of fairness and principle. All of these are aggression. None of them are called aggression by the people who practice them. And understanding them as aggression, understanding the underlying drive that is seeking expression through these indirect channels, allows you to respond to them more effectively and less confusedly than if you take them at face value. The law of generational patterns is one of the more profound and melancholy of Greene's laws. It observes that we are all, whether we know it or not, deeply shaped by the generation that preceded us, by the particular anxieties and ambitions and wounds and triumphs of our parents, which were in turn shaped by the generation before them, which were shaped by the generation before that, in an unbroken chain that reaches back through history. The child of a parent who grew up in poverty may find themselves, decades into a life of material security, still driven by an anxiety about money that is not proportionate to their actual circumstances, because the emotional template was set by a reality that no longer exists. The child of a parent who suppressed their own ambitions may find themselves in a peculiar double bind around their own success, driven by their parents' unlived dreams, but also unconsciously guilty about achieving what their parent could not. These patterns are invisible precisely because they feel so natural, so self-evidently true, so simply how things are. They are not. They are inherited. And like all inherited things, they can, with effort and awareness, be examined and to some degree chosen. The law of death, which brings Greene's book toward its enormous, solemn close, is perhaps the most quietly radical chapter of all. It observes that most of us, most of the time, live as if we will not die, as if the fact of our mortality is a kind of theoretical background fact rather than an immediate, present reality that should be informing every choice we make. We defer, we postpone. We put off the difficult conversation, the meaningful project, the genuine commitment, the real confrontation with what we actually want our lives to be, because we have the comfortable and completely false sense that there is always more time. And then there isn't. And then it is too late, or nearly too late, and we are confronted with the distance between the life we imagined and the life we lived, and that confrontation, which is the confrontation that awaits every human being who lives long enough to have it, is the kind of pain that no amount of achievement or acquisition can relieve. Greene does not moralize here. He does not lecture. He simply observes, as clearly and directly as he observes everything else in this book, that the awareness of death, genuinely held, genuinely felt, not as a theoretical proposition, but as an emotional reality, is one of the most clarifying and liberating forces available to a human being. The person who truly knows they will die is the person who is less likely to waste time on resentments that don't matter, on status competitions that are ultimately meaningless, on the performance of a life rather than the living of one. The awareness of death creates urgency. It creates prioritization. It creates, in the best cases, a kind of fierce and grateful attention to the present moment and the people and work that actually matter. And this brings us, finally, to the overarching vision that holds all 18 laws together. Because the laws of human nature is not, despite its occasional darkness and its unsparing examination of human dysfunction, a pessimistic book. It is a book about becoming more fully and consciously human. It is a book about the possibility, never easy, never complete, but always real, of transcending the worst of our inherited patterns and intentional limitations, and becoming what Greene calls the higher type, the person who has looked honestly at human nature, including their own, and who has chosen, as deliberately as possible, what to do with what they find. The higher type is not a saint. They are not without ego, without ambition, without darkness. They have all of these things. But they have a particular relationship with their own nature that is characterized above all by honesty and intentionality. They know their emotional triggers, and they have strategies for working with them rather than being controlled by them. They understand that other people are as complex and as driven by unconscious forces as they themselves are. And this understanding makes them simultaneously more effective in their dealings with others and more genuinely compassionate toward the difficulty of being human. They have done their shadow work at least partially. They have confronted their compulsions at least partially. They are not in flight from reality, and they are not sustained by illusions. They see what is, and they act from that seeing with as much wisdom and generosity and craft as they can muster. This is Greene's gift to his reader, not a formula for success or a map to power, though the book is certainly full of practical strategies, but something more fundamental, a sustained invitation to see clearly. To see yourself clearly, to see others clearly, to see human nature with all its contradictions and shadows and astonishing capacities for both cruelty and beauty clearly. Because clarity, Greene believes, is the beginning of wisdom. And wisdom, deployed with patience and skill and genuine care for the people around you, is the beginning of a life well lived. The book closes as it opened, with a sense of the enormity of the project of becoming more fully conscious, more genuinely human, more honestly yourself. It is not a project that is ever completed. It is not a destination you arrive at and then stop. It is a practice, ongoing, imperfect, sometimes discouraging and sometimes exhilarating, that unfolds across an entire lifetime. And the fact that it is never complete is not a reason for despair, but a reason for continued engagement, because the practice itself, the practice of paying attention, of seeking understanding, of acting from the best of what you know rather than the worst of what you fear, is its own reward. It is, Greene would argue, what the examined life actually is. And so we come to the end of this long, slow journey through Robert Greene's vision of human nature. 18 laws, hundreds of historical figures, thousands of years of human behavior examined and re-examined and turned in the light until the patterns emerge. The irrational self, the narcissistic self, the performing self, the compulsive self, the envious self, the grandiose self, the short-sighted self, the defensive self, the self-sabotaging self, the repressed self, the aggressive self, the generationally haunted self, the mortal self, and inside all of these, present in every human being who has ever lived, the other self, the wiser, more patient, more genuinely curious self that is always available to us, always possible, always waiting for us to remember that we have the capacity to choose how we will move through the world. It is late now. It is very late. The book has been read or dreamed or both. The laws have been laid out, one by one, like cards on a table. each one reflecting something true about the strange and complicated and endlessly fascinating business of being human. And whether you remember all 18 or forget most of them by morning, whether you wake tomorrow and instantly apply the law of defensiveness to a difficult conversation or drift through the day in the ordinary half-awareness that is the default mode of most lives, something has been planted. Some small seed of the impulse to see clearly, to look honestly, to ask when you notice yourself reacting strongly or making the same mistake again or feeling inexplicably threatened or inexplicably hostile. What is this really about? What in me is speaking here? And what would the wiser, more fully human version of me choose to do instead? That is the question Robert Greene has spent nearly 500 pages asking. That is, in the end, the single most important thing in this book. And it is a question that, once genuinely asked, tends to keep asking itself, quietly, persistently, in the middle of ordinary days and ordinary difficulties and ordinary human encounters, for a very long time. In the end, this sleepy summary, with its relaxing tone and warm glow, is not meant to replace something. It is meant to point toward a much larger light. It is offered with care, and with the genuine hope that something in tonight's listening finds its way into you as an invitation. The whole book is waiting. The real depth lives there, in every word they chose and every story they told and every quiet idea they let breathe across a full page. Let this be the beginning of something you carry forward in the light of an ordinary tomorrow, and if this lamp has helped you in some way, a light keeps it burning for someone else who might need it too. Good night. Sleep well. You are, as it turns out, only human. But that, as this book has tried to show, is already rather extraordinary.